So despite the fact that we have uneven power in the media, in the field of the media with the Western politicians, we still strive to fight and we keep fighting on. I'm sure that the power is with those who has the truth on their side, and that is our side. Our today's conference is dedicated to the final results of the work of the independent committees, which dealt with the civil victims of the civil war in Sarajevo and Srebrenica in the period from 1991 to 1995. And this war definitely left a trace on today's generations and the generations of tomorrow. I will be the moderator of today's event. All of those who are with us online, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat room. We will ask your questions if we find them interesting, and we'll also have our colleagues join us online who will tell us about the results of the work of the committee. And also we have some colleagues offline with us who will do it. And now I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Leonid Vadimovich Drachevsky, the executive director of our foundation. Thank you, and hello to all the participants. I would like to tell you that this space has seen better times when this table would be normally full of people, and there were also chairs in behind, and there were passionate discussions, amongst other things, about the questions related to the Balkans. We have had such events connected to history and to the Serbs within Russian history and their input they made in the life of the Russian state and its development. We have had participants, such participants as great Serbian scientists, the ambassador of the time, Mr. Terzic. However, unfortunately, today is a different story, and we have to look at each other using Zoom, which on the one hand expands our audience, but on the other hand, it makes us feel distant. Regarding history as such, the classics of Marxism and Leninism, which were an immense part of my school education and my university education, they used to say that history is a class science. And if history is a class science, then rephrasing it, then basically history serves the needs. I don't mean to harm anyone, but then history serves in the interests of certain groups of people, some parties and coalitions. That's why I absolutely agree with Elena Ponomarova that this possibility that we have today to hold this conference, dwelling on the results of the long work of the Commission in such an immensely difficult case as the events in Srebrenica of the time and in the Balkan territory generally. It's an extremely important task. One other reason is that the most difficult is to have a look at modern history, contemporary history, because all the participants are still alive and all parties have their own viewpoint, which is usually very emotional. And it's very important to find the facts and to find the right approach and the right methodologies. We've witnessed the history being rewritten, his 1,000-years-long history. And speaking about the history of 30 years ago, to shed some light on it in an objective manner and in a way that it remains for the generations to come. That is extremely important. In this sense, of course, our today's conference and our meeting today is of extreme importance. And I would like once more to greet all of you here and to wish you a warm welcome. And I'm happy that we have with us the temporary representative of the Republic of Serbia, Mr. Slavoljub Caric, and that we will be joined by the extraordinary politician, Mr. Milorad Dodik. Thank you very much to all of you, and once again, welcome. Thank you so much for your welcoming. I hope that this conference will be interesting. We have it recorded, and I think that it will be available on YouTube later on. So a lot of people will be able to see it. And we also have within our agenda, it's important that we involve as many people as possible. We have some journalists with us, and I hope they will also present this event and the facts we present. Well, we have on the agenda the welcoming word of Mr. Milorad Dodik, the Serbian member of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but unfortunately he's not able to join us at this moment. If he has any chance at all to join us, later on we will connect him. We're keeping in touch with our colleagues in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have with us the representative of the Embassy of Serbia in Russia, the temporary representative, Mr. Slavoljub Caric, and I would like to pass the floor to him now. Thank you, Elena Georgievna. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. We need to have our eyes on the future, but we can't forget about the past. Sometimes it's difficult to present the objective picture of the past because sometimes in question are some events that we took part in, acting from different positions and viewpoints. And when we speak about the past, we need to be very careful because there's always a possibility that we misreflect the past. Also, we should by no means be guided by stereotypes and to label things. When we speak about the Serbian people who suffered both in the Great War and the Second World War II, as well as the wars that started after the breakdown of the socialist Yugoslavia, labeling has been way too easy, especially if all of that is supported by the so-called international justice. According to such schools of thinking, Serbs have been completely dehumanized by creating a framework within which the suffering of Serbs by the aggressors was not only missed, and it was not only, people were not only silenced about it, but it was even favorable in some way. The Serbian villages set on fire, the human victims between the Serbian civils, even far from the front line, are a measure of the real state of events, especially in such so-called demilitarized zones as Srebrenica. In this specific case, the murders and the suffering that started with the forming of Muslim and Croatian armed groups that initiated the process of the so-called recession of the so-called Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. From May 1992 to January 1993, in just 9 months, more than 80% of the total Serbs killed in that territory suffered. There were also more than 60 attacks on Serbian villages in the region of Srebrenica, which means that there was an attack almost once in 5 days. The attack on Skelene by the Muslim forces, which were coordinated by the military and political top of Sarajevo, was the final part of attack on the ethnically cleanest territory in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As the result, there were killed just a little bit fewer people than 2,000, leading to complete ethnic cleaning. Those were both military men and the militiamen from the villages, and more than 150 different settlements were destroyed. Until the end of the war in Srebrenica region, about 2,665 Serbs were killed. Most of them were members of military militia from villages and civil victims. Unfortunately, the Serbs are the only ones to mourn those people, their dearest ones. For everybody else, those crimes were completely invisible. Today, when the international publicity mentions Srebrenica and not so much the Muslim victims, it's basically all about Muslim victims killed in July 1995, but everything before that, including the Serbian victims of Srebrenica and Bratunac, looks like it never existed. It's similar with Sarajevo. As Professor Darko Tanaskovic mentioned, this is a martyr city, but it was not only a martyr which suffered at the hands of Serbs, but of course in Sarajevo were killed Bosnians, Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croatians. It's necessary to mention that the largest Yugoslav city after Belgrade, Sarajevo, after 1995 has kept just 10% of the number of Serbs living there before the war. In Sarajevo, during the war, some 3,000 Serbian civilians were killed. There were 211 war camps for Serbs in that period, and thousands of people were imprisoned with no obvious reasons, suffering brutal violence just because of their nationality. There has been a lot of effort made to make sure that this suffering is never heard about and those responsible never pay for them. The media and the NGOs have played a great role in the campaign of demonization and by spreading false information, focusing exclusively on the real suffering of the Muslims and ignoring the suffering of the Serbs. One of the specific aspects of this terror campaign was creating a great network of private prisons where the most terrible crimes were made. The SDA recruited and armed the key participants of this terror campaign in the end of 1991. The representatives of organized crime and former prisoners who left the prison thanks to the amnesty. We will only mention Kazane, which is located in the location Boguševac in Sarajevo district Bistrik. From mid-1992 to October 1993, in Kazane, Serbs were killed whose bodies would then be thrown in the hole. This was performed by the representatives of the 10th Brigade of the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, led by the Sarajevo criminal Mušan Topalović, nicknamed Caco. Serbs were brought there and killed by firearms and cold arms. After that, their bodies would be thrown to the hole. Out of the total of 800 Serbs who went missing in Sarajevo, some 260 went missing in the territory of Kazan. Unfortunately, no monument has been erected there ever since. And it just shows you how insignificant the Serbian victims have been deemed. Because of all of this, there's an urgent need to have reports by independent international committees dedicated to the suffering of Serbs in the territory of Srebrenica and Sarajevo. This well-founded report sheds a critical light on the results that the Hague Tribunal came with. The results come from those who support the solving of crimes performed by Serbs, amongst other things. And I would like to thank Russia for the fact that in 2015 it put a veto on the Srebrenica resolution. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you very much. These words that have been said are really fair. It's true that very few people speak about it except in Serbia and in Russia, and I hope that by joint forces and thanks to the activities of the two independent international committees, this information will spread further and further. It's really needed to mention, we've mentioned International Independent Committee several times, what it is. Basically, experts of different professions came together, starting from psychologists to military historians to linguists from a variety of countries such as Austria, Australia, Japan, the United States, Russia, Serbia, Germany. The list is quite long, the list of the countries involved. The experts were chosen, have been chosen, who are really authorities, people of authority in their sphere. And of course, we could not invite all the members of the committees to join us at this conference. That's why today we will have presentations by two members of each committee. And I will say just a few words about every member that will join us today to make sure that our audience today has a clear picture of what kind of people with what kind of background have worked in these commissions. That's really important. Regarding our plan for the next minutes, I would like to invite Mr. Vladislav Jovanovic, who should join us online, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Yugoslavia, who very well knows these events because he's personally experienced them, and he has a lot of information. So let us just make sure if he's present. He's in in Ruski Dom, the Russian house in Belgrade. I will pass the floor to him, and I would also like to thank Ruski Dom, the Russian house in Belgrade, for the initiative to provide their space for this joint conference. So today we're not only in Moscow together, we're also in Belgrade, just the way it's meant to be.
Great. As we do not have much time, I will speak about two issues. First, who is responsible for the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and what was the reason for Mr. Itzko to say that it is prohibited to argue about the war in Bosnia. As about the first question, there is, I believe that the United States of America are responsible for the war in Bosnia, and I agree with that. When the tribunal in Hague started, it was responsible for trying to find how could the independent country of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with the representatives of all three people, could look what would be if Bosnia's independence would, how would Bosnia look if we have cantons depending to different votes? And then and all the presidents of ex-republics of Yugoslavia did agree with that suggestion. About it, the only person against it was the president of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Alija Izetbegović, who demanded the independence to be proclaimed right away. And he called back his sign on the document. And then the president, Slobodan Milosevic, said that Serbia would be first to admit the independence of Bosnia, and that proves that Serbia had no war plans. And if anyone doubted that, they could just have waited for 2 weeks. Instead of that, a representative from Belgrade, from international forces, came to Sarajevo and asked, is he happy with the document? Izetbegović called back his sign, and how security system was ruined. So who is responsible? Milosevic was proclaimed as an evil force of Balkans, and everyone else was considered a victim. But when the war started in Bosnia, the first victims were Serbians. But even that is not as important. as the fact that it all provoked a war between two peoples with same Slavic descendants. Uh, Serbia was called responsible for the bombing in Bosnia. Why did America do that? First of all, to make sure that European Union would be called out for not being able to support security in its neighborhood, to correct the image of United States of America, and da ne prođe Bosne i Hercegovine, kao što su i druge zemlje it was obvious also that if Bosnia is in war, all the other ex-Yugoslavia countries will be weaker. Those are the possible reasons. Still, there are still forces insisting that just Serbia is responsible for everything that happened in Bosnia. And yes, Srebrenica was a place of awful war crime, but unfortunately, it is not, experts do not talk about all the other victims around there. Of course, revenge is not something we support, but at least it's explainable. Now, when we see when I look back on the story, we see that not a single Serbian politician, both from Serbia and Bosnia, proclaimed being ready for any kind of war. They have always insisted on peaceful resolution of the conflict. And if the cooperation between those people, we were ready, Serbia was ready to find protection mechanisms, or then, if even that was not possible, still Serbian politicians were looking for diplomatic measures of conflict resolution. And Ali Izetbegovic, before the war, he used to say how he was ready to do anything for independence. Close things said Franja Tuđman, president of Croatia, who admitted that with no war, Croatia wouldn't be independent. And that is how the country of Yugoslavia was destroyed. I believe it is important to say those things out loud. As for the second, Mr. Itzko proclaimed some new regime. And I'm sorry, the interpreter barely can hear Mr. Ex-Minister. But the freedom of word should be untouchable. Everyone has the right to speak up, and suddenly once it was about Bosnia and Herzegovina, people were close to prohibited to speak out their truth. Was it a mistake or a part of some political process? Is hard to say now. But
stavi ta projava ljaga na nju, da je ona odgovorna za zločin genocida da su Srebrenici. Drugo, da se izazove podela tamo i da se Republika Srpska počne baviti sobom zbog tog pitanja i da zaborave na ostale.
Serbia was supposed to admit its responsibility for the atrocities in Srebrenica and to forget about all the other war crimes and victims that happened in that war. And even though it is just historically unfair, and another question is, I would like to call Mr. Itzko to discuss all that. There is one more thing. The in Bosnia, it is believed that the results of work of international commissions was we all agree that the commission results of which work we're discussing today is consisted of international, the most recognizable international experts, and that commission admits that in Srebrenica it was an awful war crime, but it wasn't genocide. And it is important not to mix up those things. Because one is war crime, the other thing is genocide. And
to se javno ne izjavljuje, ali očigledno da se
it's not spoken out that there is some other forces' interest to call it a genocide.
Do sad bile najaktivnije i najbeskompromisnije u tvrdnjama da je Srebrenica izvršen zločin. Tako da je ta njegova akcija po meni možda i
My
više
opinion, his actions were more defensive than offensive to protect Serbia from possible conclusions of the mission because the problem is that talking out about Srebrenica, if we wrongly describe that crime, then people speaking up could be under a legal prosecution. We do not have much time, so that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jovanovic. You've made some quite important comments. I would only say a few words before I pass the floor to the main expert for the Balkans in Russia, a person who is not only involved in the Balkan reality, but who has been a representative of the defense of the Serbs in Hague, Mrs. Jelena Guskova. But the most important thing is for the system of international relations and the political science, the most important thing to note is that in that war, the West took sides, specifically the Croatian Muslim side, which allowed that union of the Muslims and Croats to perform tremendous crime, just as back in World War II, when the coalition of the fascist Germany and Italy also supported Croats and the Bosnian Muslims against the Bosnian Serbs, which allowed them to perform the genocide of Serbs. These have been the two occasions when the West took side of the Catholic and the Muslim Slavic peoples, and it shows the true face of the West, which we must not forget. And the fact that this foreign curator, Mr. Insko, when leaving his post, he signed this document, also shows that they never give up their course. They always want this to become some kind of a norm, which is a threat to truth and to historical truth. Back in Yeltsin's times, the so-called Kozyrev affairs at the time allowed them to break all the norms of historical truth, and because Russia didn't make a claim, didn't state its position, has led us to where we are today. This is all a consequence of what happened in the 90s. Of course, one could say you were weak at the time, but no, it was not because of our weakness. If you read the text of the negotiations between Clinton and Yeltsin on the website of the Clinton's Foundation, you can see that for that financial support, Yeltsin not only betrayed his own people, but he also betrayed his fellow peoples. And it's important to take into consideration to make some conclusions for the future. I will again say that Mrs. Guskova is the best expert in this matter. She's performed thorough investigation not only on the Yugoslav crisis, but also on the book of the representative of the president on the Kosovo and Montenegrin crisis. The book was called The Challenge, which used historical documents and facts to show how big politicians lie and how they make the big politics. Mrs. Jelena Guskova, the floor is yours. Thank you. Can you hear me? Today's crisis on the territory of ex-Yugoslavia, the breakdown of the federation, is not a tragedy only for all peoples of former Yugoslavia, but for all of Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions of refugees, mass crimes, hatred, broken lives. Different museums and libraries and churches and mosques demolished. The events are complicated, and they'll include the problems of the development of the three peoples and the fight for new states and the intervention of international forces and the theater of war, where everybody led war against everybody else. This Bosnia and Herzegovina was believed to be the most tolerant republic of ex-Yugoslavia. Mrs. Guskova will change her chair to make sure that all the participants see her.
А мой выключаем. Многонациональный.
The multinational Bosnia and Herzegovina was believed to be the most tolerant republic of ex-Yugoslavia. No one believed that inter-ethnical conflicts were possible there. And during the negotiations about the destiny of the federation, Bosnia and Herzegovina could not make a state for a long time, and the events became tragic. The Socialist Republic Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was part of the Yugoslavia, declared independence in March 1992. Basically, after that, inter-ethnical contradictions escalated to full-scale war, which lasted up to the end of 1995. Many questions in the history of these events remain open and unanswered. And such important questions which some politicians still do not wish to answer are: number one, was it possible that the collapse of Yugoslavia would be war-free? Second, why all the politics of Europe and the US were anti-Serbian? Number three, why Russia did not guarantee for the objectivity of international organizations during the consideration of the Balkan events? I have answers to these questions, but now I will not mention them because it would take a lot of time. I would just like to draw your attention to them, because by answering these questions, we can have a clear idea of the importance of these two reports that have been made. And they will also, my great book on the external politics of Russia will soon be available in Serbian and Russian, dedicated to the Yugoslav crisis period, based on the archive documents of Yugoslavia and contemporary Serbia and Russia. What Mrs. Elena Georgievna mentioned, there you have the answer to the question why Russia did not guarantee for the objectivity of the international organizations. Back then, in 1992, the Muslims provided arms for themselves before Serbs. The National Defense Committee was created in 1991 during the events in Croatia. It was preparing the people for defense and war, while the army of Republika Srpska was created only in May 1992. On April the 4th, the Serbs call it the Day of the Muslim Mobilization in Sarajevo. The buildings of the police and post offices were taken, all the most important objects, facilities of the city. The Serbs also believe this to be the day of their own uprising. A specific thing I would like to draw your attention to from that period is that the US and Europe acknowledged the union of Bosnia and Herzegovina on April the 6th, 1992. I will not explain to you, but you can imagine the importance of this fact, because they supported the unity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, meaning that the Muslim government gave priority to their actions. And it turns out that Republika Srpska and the Croatian unity were illegal, let's say, entities against which war was, let's say, allowed. You could say that the Muslims were supported by Iran and other countries, and many things were looked through regarding the crimes of the Muslims, and Serbs were the ones blamed for the escalation of the conflict, while in fact Republika Srpska fought to protect the territory where the Serbian people lived because of the bitter experience in World War I and World War II, where there was terrible slaughter of Serbian people, large-scale slaughter, so they were afraid that it would be repeated in 1992. Today, war actions in Bosnia and Herzegovina have mainly been described, but you can see one thing, because the objective treatment by the international organizations has not taken place. Some facts that were evidence against the Muslims were not talked about. I will give you a few examples. In May 1992, a special Muslim brigade, many members of which were parts of Muslim terrorist organizations, made a series of crimes, amongst others, against Muslim civils in Sarajevo. Those criminals were dressed in Serbian uniforms to create the negative image. In fact, Muslims organized a lot of crime acts that were thought to be performed by Serbs, such as the attack on the people waiting in line for bread, after which the bombing of Serbia started, the killing of the representatives of an ABC on the 13th of August, and so on and so on. This was all followed by media war against Serbs, and many of these pages in history of Bosnia and Herzegovina have been described and documented. Markale 1, Markale 2, the explosion in the street and so on, but there have been some events that we still have to fight for to be acknowledged. These reports we'll be talking about today are these two problems that are extremely important today, especially Srebrenica, Sarajevo as well, but specifically Srebrenica. The first problem is Sarajevo. The life of the city during the war was not open to outsiders' eyes. It was known that the city is encircled by Serbian artillery, that people could only survive thanks to international humanitarian help. There was crime, violence, fundamentalism, religious intolerance. Many people who wrote their memoirs have left evidence about these days, and they speak about the unbearable sufferings by Serbs and Croats, which were supported by the government, and the humanitarian organizations could not change the picture. Back in 1994, I was working in the headquarters of the UN forces in Sarajevo, and I visited Sarajevo and the Ukrainian battalion, and the Ukrainian officers of the independent Ukraine at the time, they boasted that everything left after breakfast, dinner, and supper, they give it away to the civilians. That was their very own humanitarian help. And I asked them, how do you do it? They said, we bring the leftovers to the fence, and the children who spread their hands, we give them to them. So I asked him, who do you give it away to? And they said, the Muslims and the Croats, of course. And I asked them, and the Serbs? Let the church help the Serbs. So you can see within one humanitarian organization what the treatment of the Serbs was. So it was really a humanitarian disaster. And I would like to say that armed people would come to the Serbian homes and there was a lot of private prisons in Sarajevo, and all of that remained dark for a long time. But Mr. Ivanišević, who was the head of the Institute on Serbian Victims in the 20th century, prepared a book with the list of all victims killed in Sarajevo, every single name he could find. And of course, the second question is the question of Srebrenica, which I believe to be very important. Why? Because they try to include us in the European system of mandatory politics, which is simply not truth. And Russia is now against it. But I think that Serbia also needs to resist this process more, while Republika Srpska is doing just great. It initiated creating the Commission of the International Investigation of Srebrenica. Today in the world, you can still hear this claim that Srebrenica is the synonym of the genocide of the Muslim people by Serbian military men, which is simply not truth. It didn't happen. And this report tracks minute by minute what happened in that town. The thing is, it was clear. There is a movie showing that General Mladic did enter Srebrenica, but he didn't kill a single person. He only had 2 tanks. Before that, he passed 40 Muslims villages without killing a single person. And the troops from the Netherlands were agreed that he would enter and the people, the civilians would be taken out of the town. And it's documented how they were sent out by buses. So now what about those victims? They're talking 8,000 victims. What happened? Where did they come from? Because there were no victims in the town. From this viewpoint, this report is extremely important because the majority of the victims appeared when the column of the Muslim armed military men went from Sarajevo to Tuzla, saving their lives. This is what the report highlights. It's also important how it was created, because we have much additional information by the scholars addressing this question. We've been collecting it little by little, so that ultimately it leads to publishing some books and results. While the members of the committee use different sources, they could request sources from documents from sources that are not available to us, including the Muslim government, the Hague Tribunal in Den Haag. I would like to say that Vojislav Šešelj, during his time in the tribunal, he wrote a huge book, including documents on Srebrenica. And now it's known that the killing of Srebrenica was done by the intelligence of the US, England, and so on. The American John Schindler published a work showing that Sarajevo gave away Srebrenica to create this image of a tragedy for the world for which the Serbs were to be blamed. There is an episode from the book where Mr. Izetbegovic said to the authorities in Srebrenica, Clinton told me in 1993 that it would be nice that the Serbs would enter Srebrenica and slaughter 9,000 people, then we will have international foreign intervention. These facts from the memoirs are not part of the report, but the intention is there to investigate these affairs to the end. It's important to keep speaking on. It's important to spread those reports. It's important that they be read in different languages in Europe, the US, in France, in Great Britain, and so on. The situation in today's world is different, and I'm sure they would find attention. For 25 years, the fight has been on for the information, truth, and justice. Milorad Dodik called it the epidemic of lies on Srebrenica. For a long time, there was a secretariat working in the field of the relations with the tribunal in Den Haag. They have a lot of documents which were used for the report. And I would like to tell everybody that we cannot have our arms crossed. It's only by the efforts of Russia and Banja Luka, because the president of Republika Srpska and the Serbian member of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina has actively resisted this last decision by INSCO. And Mr. Dodik has a great argument. If the decision has not been published in special information gazettes, then it does not go into force. And so he said it would not enter into force on the Republika Srpska. I am part of the Senate of Republika Srpska, and we have made a decision that these two questions need to be spoken about. Today we have great results, and from us and from you, it depends on us and you that the knowledge about these documents spreads as wide as possible. Thank you so much, Yelena Yurievna. Because of some technical problems, we have to change places all the time. Thank you so much, dear colleagues. There's a technical issue technical question I would like to ask the foundation. Because we have the recording, I would like to ask you to make a special video of the report by Mrs. Guskova and by other participants so that we could publish it on YouTube and other channels that we have, because these are some very important issues. We'll have a technical break for technical reasons of 5 minutes. If some of you need to take this time for your personal needs, please do. And then we will go to the second part of our agenda.
Дорогие переводчики, я вас всех тогда выключаю, и мы заново подключаемся. Вы меня слышите? Здравствуйте, слышно меня? Это русская дорожка.
А как можно выйти... прекрасно, смотрите, видите, вас видно. Да, а вот как можно выйти из этого экрана, что русский дом у нас в центре?
Анна? Все слышно, все отлично. Хорошо, я тогда подключаюсь на английскую. Я на английской, все нормально, меня слышно. Отлично. Ну, давайте тогда как раз вы немного передохнете, и через 2-3 минутки мы, как вернемся, все начнем. Спасибо. Профессор Израили? Наргиса.
Hello.
Hello. Елена Георгиевна.
Anna.
Приветствую еще раз всех. Мы продолжаем работу нашей конференции, и сейчас наша секция будет посвящена обсуждению итогов работы независимой международной комиссии по Сараево. Сербские жертвы в гражданской войне в Сараево. И я предоставляю слово председателю этой комиссии, он к нам онлайн подсоединится, Рафаэлю Израили. Он является признанным специалистом по проблемам международного терроризма, вопросам Ближнего Востока, профессор Еврейского университета в Иерусалиме, научный сотрудник Института Трумана по продвижению мира в Иерусалиме, автор более 50 книг и научные статьи на сотни переходят. И действительно вопросы радикального исламизма, терроризма являются его приоритетом. И мы должны помнить, что проблема радикального исламизма появилась на Балканах именно в результате вот тех событий, которые мы сейчас изучаем. Первые маджахеды, как боевики, они появились в условиях ведения Боснийской войны. Они были сознательно, специально туда завезены. Так называемые структурные ячейки террористические, которые многие из них сегодня являются спящими, они возникли именно тогда. И вот тот миграционный кризис, который сегодня продолжается в связи с выводом американских войск из Афганистана и вообще тем, что Соединенные Штаты натворили на Ближнем Востоке за последние 20 лет, непосредственным эхом отразится и на Балканах, потому что готовность ряда балканских стран принимать без разбора беженцев из Афганистана может только усилить вот эту проблему. Господин Рафаэль, вы слышите нас? Вы готовы выступить? По-моему, он нас не слышит.
If I am asked, I will.
Thank you. Please.
No? Can you hear them? Yeah, I hear you. It's okay. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Professor Israeli.
Okay. So shall I start now?
Yes, yes, please. The floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon, my friends. I am happy to be with you again. We have much to talk about, but very limited time. So what I will do is I'll suggest a few definitions so that we are sure we are talking about the same things and that we understand each other. And then I will start with some generalizations about our report. And then I'll speak, as time allows, about the core issues or some of the core issues that I learned from my experience and that we wrote in our report. So first of all, when I would like to start with the question of objectivity, but because since that report was published, I hear many questions and very often, which rightly put a question mark about the credibility of the report. And of course, it is very legitimate to ask some questions, of that sort, because I personally don't believe in objectivity. Nobody is objective. A piece of dead wood who has no feelings or no cultural luggage behind it can be objective. But a human being has a culture, a background, a family, personal attachments, biases, and what have you. And therefore, what I ask anybody who does a report of that sort is not to be objective, but to be fair. And fairness means that you have or you can produce or express your point of view, but at the same time, try at least to express or to understand the view of others. And that is the best one can do. And indeed, during our work in the Commission, we invited a few or more than a few Bosniaks from Bosnia and Herzegovina to express their views of the whole war. And all of them refused. So they refused, they may have their good reasons. Maybe they didn't want to give legitimacy or credibility to the conference by refusing to participate in it. But maybe also that they had something to hide, and I will never know the answer to that question. Now, we tried to keep this credibility of the conference by other means too. First of all, when the commission was appointed, there was a strict balance between various parties. For example, there was one delegate, one member of the commission, Victor, whom you will hear right after me, from Russia, and another one, Larry French, from the United States. So the two big powers were there. And then we had two Europeans, one French and one Italian journalist, who unfortunately passed away in the process of the work, and we regret him terribly, but we also recognize the tremendous impact he had on the findings of the commission. And the other two members of the conference, one Serb and one Israeli, who is talking to you now and who was appointed as the head of the commission for better or for worse. Now, from the beginning, we decided that we are not going to be judges between parties, who is right or who is wrong. And as the saying has said it before, war never determines who is right or who is left. War only determines who is left. That is to say, all the others were killed. And those who are left, like us, are doing the investigation of the thing. And we have always, of course, to bear that in mind. In addition, we have also decided to publish our findings not only as an official report by the authorities of Republika Srpska, who have appointed us, because anybody, everybody, and indeed they do so, will continue to say that since it is a commissioned report, then it cannot be trusted, as if we had an axe to grind. And I want here to stress that we were and we still are absolutely impartial. I said not objective, nobody can be objective totally, but to be impartial because we don't have any axe to grind. And for that reason, we also did not get any remuneration for being members of the commission. We did it as an act of conscience because we thought that this is a big issue that had to be weighed, if not judged, by somebody from the outside. And indeed, we did that. Secondly, as a scholar who is not involved in political matters, we decided that in addition to the official report, who will have by nature little credibility, we will publish that report also academically. And therefore, we obtained the permission to publish that entire report in a press, a commercial press in America, that not only makes sure that it's an academic and really as close to objectivity as possible, but it also ensures a much wider diffusion around the world than an official report can attain. So in all those ways, we tried. You disappeared from my screen, sorry. Well, anyway, in all those ways, as I said before, we try to be as close to objectivity and credibility as possible. Now to the definitions that I think are essential. First of all, unlike what was suggested by the previous speaker, wars or justice cannot be decided by the number of dead in war, by saying that this has so many thousands of dead, more than the other, and therefore he is right. I rejected that kind of thing. For example, in World War II, the number of Germans who were killed in Dresden is much, much higher than the British who were killed by the bombs of the Germans in Coventry or in London. Does that mean that the Germans were right in this war? No, they started the war and they got they were remunerated for their deeds, and therefore try to avoid that. Next is the question of genocide. Now, anybody who loses 10 people in war or in conflict cries foul because said this is genocide. Genocide, not everybody can throw the word. The genocide has very, very definite borders. First of all, in order to be considered genocide, it has to be declared as a policy or at least as an intention. And in all the records we checked in the Serbian and other documentation that we looked through, I never saw any intention or declaration of any Serb of authority that he wants to exterminate either Croats or Muslims who were involved in that war. But unfortunately, the reverse I did see and heard. In World War II, the Ustasha government had declared, and this is on record, that their intention is to eliminate, they said the word eliminate, 1/3 of the Serbs who were in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to expel 1/3 and to convert into Catholicism, the religion of the Croats, the other third. That is the declaration of genocide. Of course, the Serbs, in our view, were not exactly saints. There was a Srebrenica, and there were many atrocities in many other places. But the Muslims and the Croats did no less. And therefore, as I said, we can lament the death of so many thousands of people who are all victims of the war, Serbs and Muslims and so on. But this accusation or blame cannot be attributed to one party, as has been done, unfortunately, in the Western press and in America. And speaking of Western press, we have encountered during our investigation horrible cases where major newspapers of Europe, like Le Monde and some German newspapers and some British newspaper, not only misreporting cases of horrors against the Serbs, which were reversed and attributed to the Serbs, but some of those cases were manufactured or staged before the cameras so that they can report how evil were the Serbs. I cannot say that I'm absolutely sure that the Serbs didn't do the same, but I did not encounter, or the Commission did not encounter cases of that sort. But Muslim and Croat cases of that sort, we saw plenty. And one has to say that in order not to sin to the reality or to the truth. Now, I said that in order to characterize this mass killing as genocide, I said, first of all, there must be an intention, and I tried to show that there was no intention of that sort stated by any Serbian authority. But there is also another criterion, and that criterion matters in terms of numbers. Because, for example, you can say that you want, or in reality, 100,000 people died or were killed, and that's horrible, of course. But it depends, 100,000 of how many? If you say that about the Macedonians, who are 2 million people, so 100,000 is 5% of them. And that you can say, well, it's a big chunk of the people and therefore it's genocide. But if you kill 100,000 Chinese or Indians, where they have more than 1 billion people, that is also horrible, of course. But it's not the same impact on the majority of the nation or of those peoples as it can affect a small nation of Jews, for example, that 1/3 of them, 6 million, were murdered as a genocide that the Germans intended and declared that they wanted to do. That is genocide. So numbers are also important. Now, I would like also to say that when you want to look at the results of the war or the conflict and when you do this kind of investigation and try to find the truth. Then, of course, when you find the truth, we, as an independent commission of inquiry, of course, could not or should not consider what every one of the parties says, because every party has its narrative. And unfortunately, in the world of today, nobody speaks about historical truth. But they said there are narratives, and everybody is entitled to his own narrative. So if it is only narrative, then we live in a world of lies. And therefore, I personally, I hope also the members of the other commission, but we never spoke about it that way, I regarded it as a piece of historical investigation. And the historical investigation means that we do our work of comparing and crossing information from different sources, and we come by distillating those facts from the general context to find what is the truth of every single event. And that's what we try to do. And therefore, I could also afford to publish all those things as an academic finding, because in academic finding, you are not partial to anything. You, as if I investigate an inside fighting between the Indians in some Indian reserve in America, about which I have no concern, and I couldn't care less who of them wins or doesn't win, because as I said before, I am not partial to any of them. And that we should, of course, watch for generation. One of the main issues in the war, which remains for me a very big or very mystical to this day, is the surprising and, to my mind, very unjust involvement of the United States, who brought with it also NATO and Western Europe into that terrible war. And one does not understand how these Western Christian nations could have involved themselves in supporting not only Muslims and sometimes Muslim terrorists. Many of them are not native, but were imported from the outside. But they also invited Islam into the heart of Europe and broke the continuity from Russia to the Aegean Sea via Greece of Christian territory, because by introducing a Bosnia and Herzegovina Muslim country, as they wanted, and of course also Kosovo after that, and basing on Albania, which was there before, and supporting Muslims in Macedonia, who are already claiming for their part in power, they simply drove a wedge in the heart of Europe of Islam, which breaks that continuity. And now from Russia, Germany, Austria, into Central Europe and into the Balkans, you have those Muslim entities which break that continuity. And I wish it stayed at that, because on top of those Muslim entities which are there already and which plan to expand, you have also Muslim outsiders who still are scheming to feed those groups of Muslim fundamentalism in the heart of Bosnia and Herzegovina, encouraged by the successors of Elijah Izetbegovic, who are not there anymore, but his son. And the SDA party continued that tradition. And that is, I think, what should have been the concern of the Americans when they did, or misdid, I should say, their wrong planning under the American Clinton administration at the time. And what was that calculation which proved to be wrong? I remind you that at that time.
Напоминаю вам, что в это время.
Pardon? Somebody is talking to me?
Господин Рафаэль, you have 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes.
I have a lot of time. God created the world in 1 minute, so I can try. So maybe I will not then explain what the Americans do and why they did it, because there is one another small item that I had. The Islamic revival I have spoken, but not only the history since the 30s and so on. So I'll skip that. But one thing I would like to remind, as members of our commission, we had 2 experts, real experts, not like the others who were just scholars. The difference being that scholars only know things. The experts, the real experts, know what to do about it. And these 2 experts of ours, one doctor and one psychologist, also detected in the midst of all our findings the trauma, not only of the war or during the war, but also the post-trauma that is lasting and enduring after the war. Now we are 25 years after the war, and is ruining the psychological and emotional life. And it will do so maybe for generations to come, people who have endured those horrors of the war and will keep the memory of them. So I rest my case, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Очень, конечно, важные.
It's of course very important, this point regarding the fact that we need to read the report in details, because the numbers and the nuances are important. So that's why we're expecting the possible Russian translation, of course. Obviously, most of our specialists, if not all of them, can read in English, but to make sure that it's publicly present, we need it in Russian. Regarding Sarajevo, before we go to we pass the floor to Mr. Bezruchenko, the Vice President and the member of Sarajevo Commission, I would like to draw your attention to the 2 major crimes. The first of them being the fact that in today's Europe, such actions have been taken that the capital of a major republic, just as Mrs. Guskova mentioned, of a tolerant republic, in a matter of few times, it was basically converted into an ethnically clean city, Sarajevo without Serbs. Isn't that genocide that was performed? When I visited Sarajevo a few years ago, East Sarajevo was built because the people were made leave the old Sarajevo. And that is, of course, that of course makes a huge impression. East Sarajevo is a light and clean city with an amazing aura, and while in the old Sarajevo, I could feel the bitterness, the anxiety. It followed me. That was the first crime, creating an ethnically clean city. And the second crime was hiding this information, this fact from the world community. This is a lie that has been out for tens of years. The task of the Commission, I would like to thank all the members for writing this report, is to draw attention to this fact. They noticed it and they experienced it. Now I would like to pass the floor to the War Tribunal expert on ex-Yugoslavia, who has worked in the UN missions for many, many years, who has experienced it with his own eyes, and then worked with the documents around the world. Mr. Bezruchenko traveled the world and he's witnessed how this political and historical injustice is being shaped. So, Mr. Viktor Bezruchenko, please, the floor is yours.
Вот, камера сразу вас поймала.
Хорошо. Уважаемый господин временный поверенный,
Dear Mr. Temporary Representative, the colleagues and the hosts, I would first of all like to thank you for the invitation to be part of this conference and to wish you success in your work. My name is Viktor Bezruchenko and I'm the Vice President of the Sarajevo International Commission. I'm an ex-officer, a candidate of political sciences, and I have my master's degree at Sarajevo University. I worked in the UN organizations for a long time, 9 of them in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1992 and 93, I was the head of UN headquarters in Sarajevo, and then up to 2012, the head of the regional mission of the UN in Sarajevo. Because Mr. Raffaele has told you a lot about the methodology of the work of the Commission, I will not dwell on it, and I will skip to results within my competency as an expert. The Commission believed it is necessary to make its minds on the key issue in this war, its character. As you know, in the academic circles in the West and in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the predominant viewpoint is that the war was an act of aggression from Serbia by the so-called domestic chetniks. In Republika Srpska and Serbia, this war is called Odbrambeno-otadžbinski rat, meaning defensive homeland war. The Commission has analyzed this question based on 6 criteria, which are part of the international humanitarian rights and by the Red Cross. I will not dwell on them in detail. I would only say that the Commission made a definite conclusion that the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was a civil war. I would also like to note that in 1993, the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo blamed the Republic of Serbia before the International Court of Justice in the UN not to be mixed with the tribunal. So it blamed Serbia for genocide and aggression. The court lasted 14 years and it made its verdict. The verdict being that Serbia is not responsible for genocide and the aggression, and it freed Serbia from any liability for those events. This is the first result. The second conclusion, the Party of Democratic Act, or SDA, made an overturn in Sarajevo to come to power in the night between the 4th and the 5th April. They had a military campaign in this city, taking over all the government buildings, the post offices, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and so on. Several Serbian policemen were killed during those events. On the 5th and 6th April, there were demonstrations in this city. The demonstrants requesting immediate leave of their government. And using the fact that some unknown persons opened fire from Holiday Inn, the SDA started open armed aggression, and the city became split into two between the two sides. The key point was to create a chaos and to create a military overturn before the international recognition of the country. The second fact, in March 1992, following the act of the president of Croatia, Croatian troops entered Bosnia and Herzegovina on 26th of March in the village of Sjekovac. Serbian nationals, Serbian ethnical Serbs were killed, and similar acts took place in Zvornik and other places. Then the military troops of Bosnia and Herzegovina received a secret directive on the protection of sovereignty of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina 2.2. The directive defined the Serbian Democratic Party and the Serbian people and the Yugoslav army as the enemy. After that, the Muslim troops came to active war actions across the country. That was nothing but a declaration of war to the Serbian people and the Serbian Democratic Party, which had previously won a majority of voices in municipalities with the majority of Serbian people. It also declared war to the Yugoslav army. On the 3rd of March, the Muslim troops attacked troops in Dobrovoljačka Street in Sarajevo, killing both officers and civilians. Then a similar action took place in Tuzla. Between September 1991 and May this next year, the Muslim troops and attacked the Yugoslav army representatives 220 times, killing many people. This army was basically a military tool of the SDA and was 90% comprised by Muslim people. And there were also many mujahideen from Afghanistan and the Middle East. That's why they had no right for claims that they were protecting the sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the equality of all three peoples. It shows that they had performed aggression. In fact, they had performed aggression against. Third conclusion, the occupation of Sarajevo was not, the point of it was not the demolition and the eradication of the people. The international humanitarian right does not forbid occupation if it is in line with international humanitarian norms. Historically, starving was the main method of occupying a city. However, in Sarajevo's case, that was not the point. The airport of Sarajevo was given to the UN mission, which provided possibilities for humanitarian help. Up to 1996, January 1996, more than 12,000 flights were performed with bringing humanitarian help to the city, 90% of that help being food. Every day, the Sarajevo would receive 150 tons of humanitarian help. In reality, up to 20% would be distributed between the members of the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In July 1993, the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina finished the building of the tunnel 700 meters long under the runway of the airport of Sarajevo. It was used, amongst other things, to transport more than 100 tons of arms and food into the city. Thanks to the massive humanitarian help, the Sarajevo people were never starving, which was acknowledged by Mr. Basuni, the expert on international rights. Quote, the fact that the people were not starving or experiencing lack of water make it undermine the argument that the starvation of the city was planned. According to between 1992 and 95, 143 international delegations visited Sarajevo, including high government officials and including the representatives of the UN, including the General Secretary. President Izetbegovic and his delegations more than once traveled to Geneva for international negotiations. All these facts make it impossible to speak about the siege of Sarajevo. Professional terms were used, such as a blockage of the city, while Izetbegovic and his people were using the historical term siege, which was not simply truth. In some memoirs, it's mentioned that there were two blockages, one on the Serbian side and the other one on the side of the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Regarding in one of the reports of the UN about human rights in ex-Yugoslavia, it was mentioned that around 700 old and ill Serbs that were allowed to live in 1992 were only left to live next year, and around 70 of them died while waiting. Some authors make parallels between the blockage of Sarajevo and Leningrad. However, these parallels are out of line due to their consequences. In Leningrad, the blockage, around 1 million people died because starvation was chosen as a method. War operations in Sarajevo were also initiated by the Muslims, which brought 2 civil victims. Sarajevo was the battlefield of 2 parties at war. From the documents analyzed by the Commission, it is obvious that the corpse of the Serbian corpse was not more than 13 thousand people, while the opposing corps had at least 60,000 people, and then it grew up to 75,000 people. The Serbian troops, the usual claims is that they had a lot of artillery, which is not real. They did have some artillery, most of which was out of date, but it was never 100,000 tanks. The army of Bosnia and Herzegovina had enough artillery and people to solve the tasks that were in front of it. The government of the Republika Srpska did not intend to storm Sarajevo. Its intention was to provide the territories where Serbian people lived and to prevent the enemy from entering Podrinje region. The one part of the city with the 120,000 people were called the Serbian Sarajevo. Basically, the Serbian army troops were defending their territory, and the Muslim troops were in offense. On 18 June 1992, in the summer of 1992, there were a number of defense operations which all were not successful. In May 1993, Trebević 1993 operation was also unsuccessful, and the last offense of the corps in Sarajevo was in June 1995. 5 corps of the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina participated. It was also unsuccessful, with a lot of men lost, around 3,000 injured. The offensive operations of the Muslims were followed by artillery attacks, which would then be replied by the Serbian artillery, which brought human victims from both sides. There have been cases evidented when the Muslim troops would put their artillery, aim their artillery at major infrastructure objects, provoking the Serbian troops to reply. Such tactic is not in line with the international rules of war. Whenever the Muslim troops did not take any action, the situation in the city was relatively peaceful, which is confirmed by the international organization's report. The Operation Vuko was in the summer of 93, was preliminarily exited because of the fear of the international aviation. The Commission has studied 3 resonance events in Sarajevo, such as the attack on the people waiting in line for bread in 93, and the Markale 1 and Markale 2 incidents in 94 and 95. The Commission has made a conclusion that there is enough data confirming that the Serbian troops were not involved in those events. Regarding the first event, in which 16 human lives were lost, the finding is that it was a provocation to prevent the international recognition in Lisbon. General Mackenzie also joined this opinion. Mackenzie was Mackenzie had to leave the mission without any sufficient reason. In Markale 1, 68 people were killed, and Serbs were blamed for it, according to the Mr. Vidas Bosnian expert. The intelligence from Canada, Denmark, Belgium, and so on came to the conclusion that the incident was performed by the Muslim side. Many years later, this was confirmed by a man from Izetbegovich's personal guardship, who confirmed that Mustafa Šerić was the one performed it and Mustafa Allahović the ones who planned it. The plan was confirmed by Izetbegović, and the goal of this provocation was to make the US enter the war. The responsibility for Markale 2 in August 95, when 37 people were killed and 89 were injured, it was also for it, Serbian troops were also blamed. However, an independent investigation showed that the Serbian side was not to be blamed. The head of the UNPRO-4 investigation in Sarajevo made it clear that the Muslims were to be blamed for this incident. The Joint Intelligence Committee came to the conclusion that the incidents Markale 1 and 2 were probably organized by the head of the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In September that year, one of the Russian media informed that it was the result of actions by international intelligence services. The infrastructure of the Republika Srpska was systematically damaged by air attacks in which uranium was used, which led to a rise of oncological diseases in civilians. According to the data from 1991, Serbs were about 20% of the citizens, Croats about 10%, and Muslims up to 80%. Sarajevo was one of the major cities with Serbian people living in it. Serbian artists, sportists, musicians, and so on are part of the heritage of the city. The strategy of the SDA was to make the Serbian community lead Sarajevo and to have an ethnically clean city as the capital. From the beginning of war, Serbs became victims of chauvinism and terror. According to the Olympic champion living in Sarajevo at the time, Serbs became hostages of such chauvinism. In the very first days of war, around 800 Serbs were arrested and enclosed in an improvised concentration camp. The Serbian Democratic Party was declared totalitarian and was denied. Kidnapping started, arrests, rape, and murders. Kidnapping became quite common. Serbs would be taken to private prisons which they would not leave. The commission found that people could only leave it for money. There were around 200 prisons, Čelibić and Silos being the most terrible ones. Milorad Ekmečić, a professor of history, was beaten in front of his family. He was then taken to a private prison. He was a delegate of the Serbian Democratic Party and there were a number of politically active Serbian ethnic Serbs who were part of the Serbian Democratic Party and who were killed by unknown people, sometimes in their own homes. The predominant business in Sarajevo became the illegal taking over of Serbian flats in Sarajevo. They would be declared abandoned and would be given to other ethnic people. The eighth conclusion: the campaign of the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina was active in the anti-Serbian terror campaign. These criminals from Sarajevo also became part of the Muslim troops, and Izetbegović's government was closely linked to the criminal. Several such former criminals became heads of brigades that were controlling certain areas of the city, who would perform the so-called confiscation, which was used as an excuse to rob and to kill Serbian people. Many people who were kidnapped never returned. Their bodies were later found in the hole in Kazane. I was told that such bodies, to hide the traces of the crime, such bodies would be burned after being spilled by with gas. In 1996, in Sarajevo, Trebjević II operation took place in order to arrest Saci, one of the head of such formations. He was then killed following the order from Mr. Izetbegović, who did not want to keep him alive for the sake of his evidence. In 1998, working in the UN missions, I had my own investigation and I made a report which I presented to the International Tribunal on ex-Yugoslavia. I was struck to learn that no one was interested. According to Mr. Mirko Vijanović, whom I have met in person, the number of Serbian victims by the hands of SDA is 2,000 to 3,000 people, including the missing ones. There is also evidence that during the SDA, more than 3,000 people Serbs were killed in Sarajevo.
В докладе комиссии зафиксированы многие случаи смерти граждан сербской национальности в сербском Сараево из-за артиллерийских обстрелов и огня снайперов. В качестве примера можно привести убийство мусульманским снайпером двух девочек, Наташи Учур и Милицы Иванович, 9 и 11 лет, в Гробовице 11 марта 1995 года. Согласно базе данных Центра Республики Сербской по исследованию войны, расследованию военных преступлений и поиску пропавших без вести, на территории довоенного Сараева было убито 1770 граждан сербской национальности и 256 солдат ВРС. База данных содержит соответствующие данные по каждой жертве, погибшей в период с 92 по 95 год, а также включает имена 174 лиц, пропавших без вести. Эта оценка представляется достоверной, учитывая тот факт, что в районе Сараева были сожжены и разрушены 56 сербских сел и поселков. После войны было идентифицировано 26 сербских братских могил. Вывод 8 и предпоследний. Ответственность СДА и Забеговича за преступления против сербского народа Сараева несомненна. Комиссия пришла к выводу, что преступления против сербского народа в Сараево не следует квалифицировать как преступления против человечности и военные преступления. Ответственность за эти преступления несет первый президент Боснии и Герцеговины и СДА. Его вина и вина руководства в этих преступлениях, которые до сих пор отрицаются в Сараево, не вызывает сомнений. Забегович получал ежедневные доклады от службы военной контрразведки о том, что реально происходило в городе. Невозможно поверить, что он не знал об убийствах и грабежах, которые совершались солдатами его армии. Вместе с Забеговичем ответственность за эти преступления несут бывший начальник главного штаба армии Боснии и Герцеговины генерал Халилович, его заместитель генерал Шибер, командующий первым корпусом армии генерал Каравелич, его заместитель Дахич, а также бывший министр внутренних дел Владимир Мустафович Ипушина и помощник директора службы безопасности Даут Башич, а также начальник военной полиции Лучарович. Вывод 10 и последний. Исход сербов из Сараева – результат многолетней этнической чистки. Комиссия пришла к выводу, что исход сербского населения из Сараева продолжался много лет и представлял собой следствие непрерывной этнической чистки. В период с 1992 по 1995 год психологическое и моральное давление на сербское общество и многочисленные преступления, совершенные против сербов, инициировали массовый исход сербов с территории под контролем армии Боснии и Герцеговины, что было равносильно проведению масштабной этнической чистки. После Дейтонских мирных соглашений несколько общин бывшего сербского Сараева – Багоша, Ильяш, Хаджичи и Илиджа – были реинтегрированы в мусульманско-хорватскую федерацию, начиная с 3 февраля 1995 года. Реинтеграция должна была быть завершена в течение 45 дней. После объявления о ожидаемой реинтеграции сербы под давлением властей федерации начали массовый исход в Республику Сербскую и в Сербию, бросая свои дома и квартиры. Многие перевозили с собой эксгумированные останки своих близких, чтобы перезахоронить их в новых местах проживания. И этот исход стал пиком продолжавшейся много лет этнической чистки Сараева. По данным ООН, в этот период от 50 до 65 тысяч сербов покинули Сараево. В результате преступлений, массовой этнической чистки, целенаправленной кампании террора и запугивания довоенная сербская община Сараева практически исчезла. И сегодня сведена к 10% ее довоенного состава. В заключение хотелось бы выразить благодарность за сотрудничество и представленные материалы Центру по изучению войны, военных преступлений и поиску пропавших без вести в Баня-Луке и поблагодарить организаторов и участников конференции за внимание. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое. Когда в таком концентрированном виде, да, слушаешь то, что, в общем-то, знаешь, становится еще страшнее.
Thank you very much. And when you hear all about that, it's very fearing. And I feel that lots of information is ignored or not reported. And those victims became just a way of manipulation. Thank you, Viktor Ivanovich. If possible, I would love to send your report to the journalists. I know whatever you want, we can sign it with your last name or as conclusions of a commission. I believe that also journalists that are with us, I believe they will be able to write way more than just one article. We are done with the first session about the result of work of the independent commission, and now you can ask questions. You can ask experts, participants, both from here and those who joined us online, and you can write your questions in the Thank you so much. Thank you for your reports. They were extremely interesting, and I'd like to ask Mr. Israeli, can you hear me? Mr. Israeli, do you hear us? Could you please tell us a bit more about the role of radical Islam in the Bosnian war? First of all, about organization Muslim brothers and their close connections to Islamic political party SDA, whose head for many years was Alija Izetbegovic.
I'm sorry, could you please repeat that question? The professor is here now.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Mr. Israeli, could you please tell us a bit more about the radical Islam's role in Bosnian war? First of all, about the organization Muslim Brothers and their close connections to Muslim political party SBA, which had for many years was Alija Izetbegovic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that very, very central question that I could not include in my presentation because I was cut short. Many things I did not say. But my answer to you perhaps has two facets. One of them was just mentioned by my friend Victor, who spoke after me. He mentioned the name of Mustafa Čerić. He is the representative, as a matter of fact, of Bosnia, in Bosnia, of the Wahhabi, or the most radical, puritanical Islam in Bosnia. And he continues his sermons in the mosques, both on Friday prayers and outside of them. He gives this kind of Islamic education to many youth in the community and tries, I think, in collaboration with the SDA, that is the party of Izetbegovic, to dream about the spread of Islam, not only in Bosnia, Herzegovina, but in all Balkans. They regard all the Balkans as their field of action, representing this kind of radical Islam, which you can say is best represented in the world today by the Muslim Brothers, who have become a universal movement, having very great ambitions throughout the world. The second aspect of it is the participation of this kind of radical Islam in the war itself. And I think only via the Dayton Agreement, which ended the Bosnia war, the Bosnian government was compelled to expel or to exclude from Bosnia and Herzegovina the presence of those radical Muslims who were volunteers from the outside to conduct the jihad to win the war, but they also prepared to stay in order to mix with population, to marry perhaps Bosnian women, and to have children, and so to increase the Muslim population in Bosnia. There was, I must remember, if I remember well, a daily flight from Tehran to Sarajevo during the years of the war. And you can imagine that those flights did not bring nurses or suites to Sarajevo. They were full of volunteers for jihad or weapons, or both of them. And therefore, their participation in the war, which constituted of many units of these jihadi volunteers, was, as a matter of fact, a continuation of what the Hajar division did during World War II, when two Muslim divisions were recruited by the Muslim scholar in Sarajevo and elsewhere, in Mostar and other places, under the guidance of the great Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin Husseini, and they fought to the side of the Nazis, both to oppress the Serbs within the boundaries of Bosnia, and even to go elsewhere to other European countries where the Nazis were fighting either to expand or at least to maintain their borders when the great counterattacks of the Russians started to defeat them, as my friend Victor will probably know better to tell or to expand if he wants to do so. Well, I think that will be enough. If there are any more questions for me, because I depart otherwise.
No, thank you. Есть еще? Just a moment, please.
Добрый день, меня слышно? Да. Меня зовут Александр Жокич.
Hello, my name is Alexander Jukic. I'm assistant from Rudian University, and I'd like to ask Mr. Israeli. I've heard that Serbian community was endangered, was almost eliminated during the war, and that was partly the Sarajevo and Muslim community. Why the international community all these years during the war and after the war were not interested in investigating those questions? I also have a question for Mr. Bezruchenko, but probably I should ask it later. Thank you. So, Mr. Israeli, could you please answer the question why international forces were not interested in investigating the elimination of Serbian community in Sarajevo?
Well, look, there are two parts to that, to my answer. One is you judge by the facts that were found. You know that before the war, the Serbian population was very substantial part of the population of Sarajevo. And they liked the place, they were there for generations and they never wanted to quit. But during World War II, with the Ustaša regime, which ruled both Croatia and Bosnia as one united independent government, they were by persecution, which Victor certainly and more eloquently described than me, they were either expelled or killed, or they were converted, and they were killed mainly in the concentration camps of Jasenovac and Jadovno in great masses. So as a matter of fact, they realized or implemented the dream of the Croat and Bosnian government about the third, the 3/3 of expelling, exterminating, and converting religion. The fact is, at the end of the war, of the Bosnian War, at the end of the Dayton arrangement, so-called, that was enforced from the outside, no Serbs remained in Bosnia. And that, not in all Bosnia, but in Sarajevo, we're talking specifically. While the reverse did not happen, because in the Republika Srpska, for example, anywhere you travel, you see a lot of mosques. That means that a big Muslim minority remained in Serbian areas, but not the reverse. And even that spilled over to Kosovo. When I visited Kosovo just a few months after it declared independence, I found enclaves of several really heroes, Serbian family, who remain in enclaves within Kosovo, surrounded by the Muslims and trembling of fear that they might be either killed or evacuated or some kind of other horror done of them. Therefore, the general atmosphere in all former Yugoslavia remains that for a Serb to live in a Muslim area is dangerous, and therefore they avoid it. The vice versa, the reverse of that, a Muslim in Serbian area is pretty safe, and that makes the whole difference. Okay. Anybody else?
Yes, thank you very much.
Сейчас, Елена Георгиевна, как я понимаю, у нас есть еще и вопрос из Zoom.
Elena Georgievna, we have some question from Zoom, right?
Из Zoom у нас вопрос к господину Безрученко, правильно?
Есть и для
Мы
Израиля.
не можем очень много вопросов сейчас
всё.
задавать. У нас
We
ограничено.
cannot ask a lot of questions. Our time is limited and we still haven't had second panel.
See you very soon, hopefully.
Thank you so much. Okay, that you
У
understood.
нас господину Безрученко вопрос был. Пожалуйста.
And now we have a question from Mr. Bezruchenko. Thank you, Mr. Bezruchenko. We've heard that Sarajevo wasn't in siege during the civil war. Can you please describe us the proportion of Serbian and Bosnian forces in Sarajevo during the so-called siege? Yes, I've already said a couple of words about it. The first corpus of the Bosnian and Herzegovinian army and their task was so-called protection of Sarajevo was 5 times bigger in people than a Serbian army. It had less artillery, true, but not that less than during the war, especially during the first period. From Croatia, Bosnian side was receiving sources, the weapons from Croatia, and by the end of the war, the numbers were more or less same. In the West, it is believed that the artillery of Serbian army was shooting at the city all the time, but statistically, the peak of the war actions were when the Bosnian army was trying to break the blockade. And there is a difference between blockade and siege, because speaking from military terms, those are different things. I would also like to remind that a serious source about this history of the war is an American investigation. They are using the term siege, which is not correct, speaking out of military experts. Okay, now we need to make a 5 minutes break, and then we are going to the next part of our conference, talking about the results of work of commission about Srebrenica.
Уважаемые коллеги,
Dear colleagues,
друзья, товарищи,
dear friends,
те, кто к этому
dear scholars, and the ones striving to achieve those titles, dear diplomats, we're now going to a very important question, the question of Srebrenica. For some reason, the whole world is preoccupied with these questions, and we have no right to be aside and to be indifferent. It is first of all used for political purposes, and the actions by the Commission has turned out to be very important. A survey, an investigation has been made which completely overturns the concept that has been promoted by the International Tribunal on ex-Yugoslavia. And even in the and this has now been taken down to the level of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the pressure on the Balkan countries has been such immense that at the time, I think it was in 2015 or 10, if I'm not mistaken, the Assembly of Serbia even adopted a declaration to provide its regrets about everything that happened in Srebrenica, despite the fact that our institute addressed the Assembly of Serbia, asking them to not take any actions in a hurry because the question of Srebrenica has not been studied completely. With this report, we can now say that the majority of studies have been completed and many documents have been used which were not previously available to the scholars. Up to now, we, the scholars, could not use the documents of the tribunal. We mostly used books and memoirs, despite the fact that the documents of Republika Srpska are now available. That's why I would like to ask you to very attentively listen to the presentations by those who have prepared this report, because we now have arguments at our hands. And we can spread this information about Srebrenica to other countries. Of course, Russia will learn about it, Serbia will speak about it, Republika Srpska will speak out about it, but it's also very important that other countries also help in spreading this information, so that such international conferences would also embrace France, Italy, Germany, not to mention Slavic countries of Europe. So I'm sorry I haven't presented myself. I think you all know me. I am now the moderator in this second session. And I would like to give the floor to the head of the Commission on Srebrenica, Mr. Gideon Greif. Let's just make sure that everything is in place.
Mr. Greif, can you hear us?
I'm here. I'm waiting for your green light to start.
You have it.
I
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm honored to speak here today and present some of the main points of the report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Sufferings of All Peoples in the Srebrenica region between 1992 and 1995. The Commission was established in March 2019 on behalf of the Ministry of Justice of the Republika Srpska. It consists of 10 scholars, scientists, and experts from all continents and is composed of historians, political scientists, sociologists, pathologists, forensic scientists, anthropologists, journalists, lawyers, and a general who is a police inspector. So a big variety of personalities, all experts, well-known experts. The Commission was guaranteed that it would carry out its work completely uninfluenced by political or any other pressure. The contract agreed to by the Commission and supported by the officials of the Republika Srpska ensured that the results of the research, regardless of the results, would be published in its entirety by the Commission. The Republika Srpska fully complied with all of these conditions. The Commission conducted fact-based research into what actually happened in the Srebrenica region between 1992 and 1995 and wrote an authentic, trying to be objective, scientific report on the tragic events of the years 1992 to 1995. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, countless committees, commissions for the investigation of historical events have been established throughout history, and their conclusions have been the basis for controversy and public debate. It has always been that way, and it will always be that way. This is the nature of us, human beings. Every person sees and interprets reality with his own eyes, and the eyes see different and varied mirrors. Commissions of all kinds cannot change the past, not at all. They relate to the past, they examine it, they look at it with curious, skeptical, critical eyes. The past is an existing fact. It is open to different interpretations, but the facts remain facts. Sorry, somebody is trying to call me. Sorry. The past is an existing fact. It is open to different interpretations, but the facts remain facts, always. They cannot be recreated. The reports of the investigation committees or commissions can interpret and clarify the events of the past, place them in the right context, and find out their motives and backgrounds. The conclusions of the commissions are important for historical research, they are important for historical documentation, and are especially important for us, the human beings, so that we better understand the world in which we live and the processes that take place around us with or without our participation. The Independent Commission for the Inquiry on the Suffering of All People in the Srebrenica region between 92 and 95, headed by me, was established, as I already mentioned, in March 2019 to reach an understanding of events to the maximum degree of objectivity and from a scientific approach. I emphasize this term, scientific approach. The ingredients of the committee were authentic data, facts, archival materials, and all available sources. The commission consisted of 10 world-renowned experts, well-known scholars with a reputation in their field. When I personally accepted the appointment, I did so out of heavy sense of responsibility. As a historian who has been engaged for almost 50 years in researching the greatest catastrophe that befell humanity, the catastrophe of the Jewish people, the Holocaust, I approached a mission imposed on me out of reverence. The beginning of my research on the Holocaust, since the beginning of my research on the Holocaust, and especially my intensive study on the largest concentration and extermination camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, since then I have devoted some of my research also to other human disasters that have befallen our world. Sadly, Human history is riddled with wars, with bloodshed, deadly conflicts, and feelings of deep hatred. When I was offered with chairing the Srebrenica Events Commission of Inquiry, I saw it as part of my historical work dealing with human sufferings, the injustice that human beings inflict on each other, the tragedies that have befallen mankind incessantly since the creation of the world we live in. The Commission members were Professor Yuki Osa from Japan, Professor Stephen Meyer from the United States of America, Professor Lawrence Armand French from the United States of America, Professor Roger Bayard from Australia, Professor Maria Juric from Serbia, General Adernele Shinaba from Nigeria, lawyer Markus Goldbach from Germany, Professor Walter Manoschek from Austria, and late Giuseppe Zaccaria from Italy, who passed away, sadly, a few days before we published our final report. God bless his soul. The Commission was not influenced by any conclusions of committees that preceded it. It did not receive dictates, did not receive any instructions. The Commission took into account in advance that its conclusions, whatever they may be, would not be liked by the whole world, but this did not deter us from striving for the truth, and only for the pure truth. For 2 years, the Commission sat and discussed the bloody events of Srebrenica, which cost human lives and caused great suffering to the victims of the bloody events of summer of 1995. The work of the Commission was sensitive and complicated from the beginning, from the first moment, because previous committees and various international bodies had already judged the events of Srebrenica, both in terms of their definition and in terms of their statistics. We, the members of the Commission, therefore, had to deal with definitions and statistics that were already interpreted by those who preceded us, and with conclusions, definitions and statistics that had already were engraved in the conscious and awareness of the general public, as if they were axiomas for everything. This reality did not deter us. We were not frightened by the existing conclusions and opinions. Zealously, we decided to examine every piece of information, every document, every statistics, every photograph, every testimony, every shred of interpretation and information. We did not save time, we did not save efforts. The final report of the Srebrenica Commission comprises over 1,000 pages and is comprehensive and complete and contains every possible detail directly and indirectly related to the subject of the events of Srebrenica. In my opinion, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, this is a document that will be studied one day in all universities in the world and will be considered a masterpiece in the history of public law and in the history of regional, national, and ethnical conflicts in the world. Remember, on the legal aspects of the definition of the term genocide in the context of the committee's conclusions, a concept the committee dealt with very thoroughly, my esteemed colleague, lawyer Markus Goldbach, will speak immediately after me, so I will not elaborate on it. I have chosen in my work to emphasize the historical and moral aspects involved in the work of the Commission. The Commission did not intend to create or paint a new reality of the tragic events that took place in the summer of 1995 in the Srebrenica area. She could not, even if she wanted to create a new reality. History, as you all know, is a sequence of events in motion in which no link can be changed, even not slightly. Not even one detail can be changed. One can try to rewrite, one can try to renovate, one can try to distort, one can try to reduce, add, but the facts, ladies and gentlemen, will always remain facts. We should not forget this. All attempts to renovate reality and build a new reality are doomed to failure a priori. Given that the subject matter of the Commission's research was related to the events that had occurred between 1992 and 1995, all experts, that is our members, agreed that it was necessary to put the events that had occurred in the Srebrenica region in the proper context in order to investigate the sufferings of all peoples as objectively and scientifically as possible. The Srebrenica region, that is the Middle Podrinje, cannot be observed from a historical or any other aspect in the light of the events of July 1995, because it is a region in which conflicts between different people had been simmering since World War II. When it comes to that time period, the genocide perpetrated against Serbs in the independent state of Croatia must inevitably be mentioned. According to the estimates of the State Commission for the Investigation of Crimes in Bosnia and Herzegovina, between 4,000 and 6,000 Podrinje Serbs were murdered, brutally murdered, in April and May 1942 alone. And if one adds to that the number of those murdered by the 13th Mountain Division of the SS Handschar, a unit that consisted mainly of Muslims, the final number is significantly higher. National tensions in the Middle Podrinje, especially in the areas of Srebrenica and Bratunac, were extremely high during the 80s. Under the wing of escalation of conflicts between the nations in the former Yugoslav state in mid-90s, the situation in the Srebrenica region was also worsening at the time. I'm giving you this historical review as an example for historical research. The first Muslim paramilitary organization in Podrinje was created during this period as well, and early as 1991, so was the Patriotic League, the more organized and numerous Muslim paramilitary formation, practically an SDA military formation, which based its ideology on the postulates of the Muslim Brotherhood. All this resulted in barricades and armed village guards appearing overnight in some villages in the municipalities of Bratunac and Srebrenica, regardless of the whether the villages were predominantly Serb or Muslim. Clashes between Serbs and Muslims in the Middle Podrinje began in April 1992, and in early May, the offensive activities of the Muslim armed forces in the area of the Srebrenica municipality intensified. The attack on Skelani on January 16, 1993, that was carried out by a Muslim force based in Srebrenica, whose actions were coordinated by the military and political leadership in Sarajevo, consolidated the territory of the Muslim enclave of Srebrenica, the most ethnically pure area in wartime Bosnia and Herzegovina. During this period, the enclave was at its largest, extending to about 900 square kilometers, and it included parts of several municipalities. By this time, Muslim units had carried out complete ethnic cleansing of the entire region of Middle Podrinje and Srebrenica, in which somewhat less than 2,000 Serb civilians, soldiers, and members of the village's guards were murdered or went missing, and more than 150 different Serb settlements were completely destroyed. Muslim armed forces, Arbich, apparently committed brutal and systematic crimes in this region, with the knowledge of the Supreme Command in Sarajevo. On the other hand, by that time, the Republika Srpska army had also launched several attacks on Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina forces located in Muslim settlements, in which a number of members of the army and civilians were killed. In mid-April 1993, the agreement on demilitarization of Srebrenica and Žepa was concluded, and it was signed by representatives of the Republika Srpska army, the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the UN, who guaranteed that this agreement would be implemented, that is, that the enclaves of Srebrenica and Žepa would be demilitarized. Muslim forces in Srebrenica, led by its Sarajevo leadership, allowed themselves to be disarmed, but instead they saw the demilitarized zone as a shelter where they could reorganize their military potential and from which they could carry out operations deep inside the territory under the control of Republika Srpska army. Since the entry into force of the UN-supported agreement from mid-March 1993 to midsummer 1995, members of the 8th OG, or the 20th Division, murdered about 50 Serb civilians and soldiers in the area around Srebrenica. On the other hand, from 1992 to the beginning of 95, according to the Muslim and other sources, the Muslim side had suffered about 2,100 casualties in this region, of whom, as stated in the official monograph of the 28th Division of the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1,800 were soldiers. Due to the increasingly aggressive actions of the members of the 28th Division and the actual danger of the realization of their military and political plans to cut off the territory of Republika Srpska in the middle Podrinje, the VRS command launched an operation codenamed Krivaja 95. The original action did not involve the taking of the town of Srebrenica, but as the members of the 20th Division decided to forsake defending the town and their families and attempt a breakthrough from the encirclement, the Republika Srpska army decided to enter the town. When this then new situation is observed from military and tactical point of view, taking into consideration the low number of casualties and the sufficient amount of material and technical equipment, as well as the support of the Dutch UNPOFOR battalion, it can be concluded that had the 28th Division decided to defend the town, Srebrenica would not have fallen so quickly. Nevertheless, the command of the 28th Division ordered all active and reserve military personnel, Srebrenica police, and all able-bodied men from the civil defense and units performing war work duties together in Shushnjari. In Shushnjari, all stationed conscripts received the order to carry out the combat operations of breakthrough towards Tuzla, and they lined up in a battle formation that eventually headed towards Tuzla, passing throughout the territory under control of the VRS. There were around 12,500 people in the column. Ladies and gentlemen, the reconstruction of the events related to the movements of the mentioned column, that is, the breakthrough from the encirclement, is one of the most important parts of the Commission's report. In accordance with the estimates of casualties, which are based on the statements of witnesses who survived the breakthrough and the reports of the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, we can say that it's very likely that between 400 to 500 people were killed in the combat, in clashes between members of the same army, or that they committed suicide while the column was moving along its entire route. Precisely on the basis of that number, as well as analysis of the total number of casualties, we were able to estimate the number of captured participants in the breakthrough. Based on the data we analyzed, our estimate is that the minimal figure of captured persons is 1,500 to 2,000, while the maximum is 2,500 to 3,000 persons. In order to determine the number of persons killed in mass shootings, we started with the assumption that the total number of captured breakthrough participants is the maximum number of persons who were shot to death. When it comes to estimates of the members of the captured members of the 28th Division of Arbich were analyzed, the statements of participants in this military column documented by Bosniak military and state security service, aerial shots, and of the US intelligence platform UT, and estimates of the number of vehicles used to transport those prisoners of war from Ratunac to Batkovici and a municipality. Therefore, this mentioned number of 1,500 to 3,000 persons who were captured, that is, shot between 13th and 16th of July 1995 number, reached through criminal investigations, is completely in line with the results of the forensic anthropological analysis performed by our commission. Since all individuals killed in mass executions were initially buried in primarily graves, those graves were analyzed from the perspective of forensic archaeology. Forensic analysis showed that theoretically, the highest number of individuals that could have been buried in primary graves does not exceed 3,715 individuals, and even that number is rational only if the grave pits had been fully utilized with no empty spaces between the bodies at all. Ladies and gentlemen, concerning the term genocide, I would like to leave this part, as I mentioned, to my dear colleague, lawyer Markus Goldbach. I would like to emphasize only one aspect, which is that although the Commission does not consider the killings that took place around Srebrenica to be genocide, it acknowledges the fact that thousands of people, mostly prisoners of war, were killed, and those responsible for these crimes should be severely punished. I would like to conclude with the following words. Our Commission hopes that after this report, concrete steps will be taken towards facing the past of all, both the parties that were in conflict and the representatives of the international community, international organizations, and associations of war victims. One such step could be to pay tribute to the victims of all parties at the sites of their suffering by representatives of all the above parties. True and non-discriminatory respect for all innocent victims by the joint delegations of the above parties is a step that can contribute to a common confrontation with the past and a better understanding of the universal truth about the dignity and value of every human life. So with this humane, peaceful, and optimistic aspect, I would like to complete my short presentation, and I would be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Давайте поблагодарим.
Let us thank Mr. Greif, and let's continue our dialogue. I think that we should listen to our second expert, the member of Srebrenica Commission, and then we will sprint to questions and discussion, which is also very important to us. So the floor is now being given to the member of Srebrenica Commission, Mr. Markus Goldbach.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the events of the last months have again demonstrated that a fundamental difference exists between the Serbs and the Bosniaks, as well as scholars around the world, when it comes to understanding of the term of genocide. At today's conference, I feel humbled to present on behalf of our Commission and of the Commission's chair, Professor Gideon Greif, 3 theses on the subject. First, the individual crime of genocide does not necessarily constitute a genocide. Second, the ICTY's application of genocide to the events at Srebrenica, while plausibly consistent with some aspects of genocidal law, was flawed. It will not stand the test of time. Third, the actual facts that were found by this commission clearly contradict a genocidal intent. Thesis number 1. The individual crime of genocide does not necessarily constitute a genocide. Even though the term genocide is universally known, it has not existed before the reign of the Nazi regime. In the year of 1941, Winston Churchill described the genocidal Nazi atrocities during the invasion of Russia as a crime without a name. Only in 1944, Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin presented the term genocide in his book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, documenting the destruction of national and ethnic groups, including the mass murder of European Jews. He combines the words geno, from the Greek word for race or tribe, with cide, the Latin word of killing. According to the Genocide Convention that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on December 9, 1948, as General Assembly Resolution 260, genocide contains 2 constituent elements. The physical element, namely the act perpetrated or actus reus, and the mental element, mens rea. The 2 elements are linked, although analytically distinct. The intent, mens rea, to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, is the essential characteristic of genocide, which distinguishes it from other serious crimes. However, the actus reus does not require a factual destruction of the protected group. It does not even require the killing of one individual. It can be said, therefore, that the crime of genocide does not require a result, and courts need not to determine whether the actual method was well chosen. In other words, the crime of genocide does not require many killings, but even killings on a mass scale. They only constitute the crime of genocide if such killings have been conducted with a specific intention to destroy a substantial physical part of a protected group. Therefore, a fundamental difference exists between the crime of genocide as defined in the Genocide Convention and the general definition of genocide as the deliberate and systematic destruction of a group of people because of their ethnicity, nationality, religion, or race. The historic reason for this differentiation between actus reus and mens rea is clear. Under the impression of the Holocaust, the Genocide Convention aimed at the prevention of future genocide by trying to stop any action with genocidal intent before it could develop into a full-scale genocide. It was argued that the world community should not wait until trains would depart toward Auschwitz again, but should already be entitled by the Genocide Convention to act as the intent to commit genocide becomes visible years before. An example in the articles in Der Stürmer, by which the Germans were prepared to accept the later destruction of the Jews in Europe. In reference to Srebrenica, this means that even though individuals may have committed the crime of genocide by showing a genocidal intent, this question will be discussed in the following thesis. Any such finding by the ICTY or any other court cannot support the finding that a factual genocide has taken place. By a mere look at the numbers, it appears questionable that with the killing of several thousand men, a substantial part of the Muslim population of Bosnia has been destroyed. Thesis number 2. The ICTY's application of genocide to the events at Srebrenica, while plausibly consistent with some aspects of genocidal law, was fraud. It will not stand the test of time. The ICTY has decided to ignore the legal view on genocide as described in the elements of crime of the International Criminal Court, which will rule on all future cases of genocide. As described before, the text of the Genocide Convention creates a huge abstraction of the individual crime of genocide because it does not reflect genocidal actions. Even during the deliberations of the convention in 1946, many participants stressed that clearer definitions were needed in the future to define the crime of genocide further. It is not just the history and genesis of genocide, however, that cautions against bringing an isolated event within the scope of this crime. The crime status as a crime under general international law also suggests that a clear international dimension must exist in respect of the underlying conduct. Equally, categorizing the conduct of a single act as genocide would disconnect the crime of genocide from its historic roots as a crime against humanity. The requisite contextual element of all crimes against humanity is they must occur as part of a systematic or widespread attack against any civilian population. Such a disconnection would not only be highly implausible in light of the historical development of the law, but also for reason of coherency within the corpus of crimes under the international law. Indeed, it would be an oddity to dispense with the context requirement for the crime of genocide, while at the same time emphasizing the special stigma that attaches to this horrible crime. These concerns were endorsed by states parties when they adopted the elements of crimes under the statute of the International Criminal Court, ICC elements. These state parties decided to place the conduct of the individual perpetrator in the context of a manifest pattern of similar conduct. As one negotiator confirmed, this quasi-contextual element was introduced especially to avoid the view expressed in the Jelicic case at the ICTY that genocide could be committed by a single individual or a single action. Naturally, in the Kristich case, the trial chamber of the ICTY put up the question about the impact of the definition of the elements of crimes as adopted by the International Criminal Court, and the trial chamber decided that these elements of crimes were to be included in the deliberations of the ICTY. Quite sadly and surprising, the ICTY's appeals chamber concluded that the definition adopted in the elements of crime of the ICC did not reflect customary law in 1995. The appeal chamber decided that the offense of genocide, as defined in the statute and in international customary law, does not require proof that the perpetrator of genocide participated in a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population. In reasoning otherwise, the trial chamber relied on the definition of genocide in the elements of crimes adopted by the ICC. This definition, stated the trial chamber, indicates clearly that genocide requires that the conduct took place in the context of a manifest pattern of similar conducts. The trial chamber reliance on the definition of genocide given in the ICC's elements of crimes is an absurd. As already explained, the requirement that the prohibited conduct be part of a widespread or systematic attack does not appear in the Genocide Convention and was not mandated by customary international law. Because the definition adopted by the elements of crimes did not reflect customary law as it existed at the time Kristich committed his crimes, it cannot be used to support the trial's conclusion. So, in doing so, the appeals chamber of the ICTY overlooked a crucial opportunity to clarify the admittedly complex structure of genocide, and it set itself into direct opposition with the legal interpretation of the International Criminal Court. There can be no doubt that the elements of crime of the ICC will become the standard genocide definition in the future. Therefore, the legal basis for the ruling of the ICTY is already outdated. There is no indication that the ICC would qualify Srebrenica as a crime of genocide. But just another decision, the ICTY has decided to draw a too narrow line when it comes to the question of intended destruction of a protected group. It is well established that when a conviction for genocide relies on the intent to destroy a protected group in part, that part must be a substantial part of that group. The early commentators of Genocide Convention emphasized that the term "in part" contains a substantiality requirement. Raphael Lemkin, the prominent international criminal lawyer who was instrumental in the drafting of the Genocide Convention, addressed the issue during the 1950 debate in the United States Senate on the ratification of the convention. Lemkin explained that the destruction in part must be of a substantial nature so as to affect the entirety. He further clarified that the convention applies only to the intended actions undertaken on a mass scale. However, in recent years, it has been argued that the protected group may be defined qualitatively as well as quantitatively, or in other words, that significant rather than substantial part of a group can be targeted as well. This approach of the definition of genocide surfaced in the report of the Commission of Experts established by the Security Council in 1992 to investigate violations of international humanitarian law in the former Yugoslavia. The Commission considered the definition in the Convention to be sufficiently pliable to encompass not only the targeting of an entire group, as stated in the Convention, but also the targeting of certain segments of a given group, such as Muslim elite or Muslim women. The Commission stated, if essentially the total leadership of a group is targeted, it could also amount to genocide. Such leadership includes political or administration leaders, religious leaders, academics, and intellectuals, business leaders, and others. The totality per se may be a strong indicator of genocide regardless of the actual number killed. It becomes clear that the significant part approach, as defined by the Commission, will always raise the question what the killing of one social structure in a community will do to its survival. However, the question if a community will be able to survive as such in the long term will depend on more factors than a perpetrator will be able to foresee. In Christich, the prosecutor had argued that what remains of Srebrenica community survives in many cases only in the biological sense, nothing more. It's a community in despair. It's a community clinging to memoirs. It's a community that is lacking leadership. It's a community that is a shadow of what it once was. This appears to be a rather enormous deduction to make, considering that the community has survived in the biological sense, and that the leadership and protection of the overall group of Bosnian Muslims still exists. Furthermore, there is no mentioning that the intention of the perpetrators, this is really unchallenged in the judgment, was to ethnically cleanse the region of Muslims, not to destroy the group in a physical sense. The trial chamber appears to accept the prosecutor's contention that the intent in killing the men and boys of military age was to eliminate the community as a whole. In the words of scholar William Shavas, can there be no other plausible explanations for the destruction of 7,000 men and boys in Srebrenica? Could they not have been targeted precisely because they were of military age and thus actual or potential combatants? Would someone truly bent upon the physical destruction of a group and cold-blooded enough to murder more than 7,000 defenseless men and boys, to go to the trouble of organizing transport so that women and children and the elderly could be evacuated? It is certainly striking that another trial chamber and Securica dismissed the significant part argument after noting that the common denominator of the victims was that they're men of military age and nothing more, as if this was insufficient. The Kristich verdict continues. Granted, only the men of military age were systematically massacred, but it is significant that these massacres occurred at a time when the forcible transfer of the rest of the Bosnian Muslim population was well underway. The Bosnian Serb forces could not have failed to know, by the time that they decided to kill all the men, that this selective destruction of the group would have a lasting impact upon the entire group. They thus precluded any effective attempt by the Bosnian Muslims to recapture the territory. Furthermore, the Bosnian Serb forces had to be aware of the catastrophic impact that the disappearance of 2 or 3 generations of men would have on the survival of traditionally patriarchal society, an impact the chamber of the ICTY has previously described in detail. Now, there is a world of a difference between the physical destruction of a group and the lasting impact upon a community. If the intent of the Serb forces was to have a lasting impact on Srebrenica's Muslims, then they did not have the intention to destroy the community. The classic genocides of the 20th century, those of European Jews and Rwandan Tutsis, are distinguished by the insistence upon killing the women and children, precisely to ensure that the group is effectively destroyed. But the issue is not whether the massacre of men and boys of military age was really effective in destroying the Srebrenica Muslims. The crime of genocide does not require a result, and courts need not to determine whether the actual method was well chosen. Still, to the extent that the genocide technique is incomplete and perhaps illogical, this will cast doubts on whether or not real genuine intent was present. As war crimes, the atrocities of July 1994 in Srebrenica surely qualify. But categorizing them as genocide seems to distort the definition unreasonably. Even further away from the requirement of the intended destruction of a substantial part of a group, ICTY relates to the importance of the population of Srebrenica for the rest of the Muslims in Bosnia. The Kristich appeal chambers had made the following approach. The size of Bosnian Muslim population in Srebrenica prior to its capture amounted to approximately 40,000 people. Although this population constituted only a small percentage of the overall Muslim population of Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time, the importance of the Muslim community of Srebrenica is not only captured solely by its size. Srebrenica were of immense strategic importance to the Bosnian Serb leadership. Without Srebrenica, the ethnically Serb state of Republika Srpska they sought to create would remain divided into 2 disconnected parts, and its access to Serbia proper would be disrupted. The capture and ethnic purification of Srebrenica would therefore severely undermine the military efforts of the Bosnian Muslim state to ensure its viability, a consequence the Muslim leadership fully realized and strove to prevent. Central over the Srebrenica region was consequentially, essentially, to the goal of some Bosnian leaders to forming a viable political entity in Bosnia, as well as to the continued survival of the Bosnian Muslim people. Because most of the Muslim inhabitants of the region had, by 1994, sought refuge within the Srebrenica enclave, the elimination of that enclave would have accomplished the goal of purifying the entire region of its Muslim population. The ICTY verdict went on. In addition, Srebrenica was important due to its prominence in the eyes of both the Bosnian Muslims and the international community. The town of Srebrenica was the most visible of the safe areas established by the UN Security Council in Bosnia. By 1995, it had received significant attention in the international media. In its resolution declaring Srebrenica a safe place, the Security Council announced that it should be free from armed attack or any other hostile act. The elimination of the Muslim population of Srebrenica, despite the assurances given by the international community, would serve as a potent example to all Bosnian Muslims of their vulnerability and defenselessness in the face of Serb military forces. The face of the Bosnian Muslims of Srebrenica would be emblematic of that of all Bosnian Muslims. So this argument from the ICTY is even further away from the original meaning of substantial, while even the description of significant means that the impact of destruction of a smaller part of the group would be outweighed by the importance of the affected part of the group. Now, the impact of the destruction of an important part of the group or its territory is not necessarily felt by the rest of the group. It is to remember that the definition genocide means to physically destroy a group. By modifying the definition of a substantial group, the gap between the factual genocide and the crime of genocide is widening. It is clear that the definition of a substantial group given by the Chamber of Appeals in the Christchurch and the later verdicts do not indicate that a real genocide has happened in Srebrenica. It is moreover demonstrated that the massacre of Srebrenica was aimed at the protected group of all Muslims in Bosnia, but did not have any consequences for the rest of this group. Even worse, now the importance does not even relate to the respective, hang on a second. One second, please. Even worse, now the important...
Mr. Goldberg, sorry to interrupt. 3 minutes left.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Even worse, now the importance does not even relate to the respective group of Srebrenica Muslims, but instead to the strategic value of the stripe of land that they inhabit. And even more troubling, the region of Srebrenica and the surrounding Central Podrinje region was not even of strategic importance for the Muslim inhabitations, but for the Serb leadership. The same problematic approach can be viewed in the second part of the argument, which describes the Srebrenica region as refuge for the Muslim inhabitants of the region. Without the safe area, the region would be purified from the Muslim population. This argument fits well under the definition of ethnic decleansing, but does not have any relevance when it comes to the legal definition of genocide. Here is a connection between the fate of the Muslims of Srebrenica to the protected group of Muslims. The fate of the Bosnian Muslims of Srebrenica would be emblematic of that of all Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, it remains unclear in which way such an example would concern the protected group. Would this lead to the destruction of the protected group of all Bosnian Muslims? Or would the group prepare for similar attacks and seek support by the international community? As not, this is purely a part of intent. The Third Army forces being well aware of an upcoming attack of the Croat and the Muslim army, and has not the Serb army, in regards to Directive 7, sought to establish a better defense position. All this remains unclear, but the creation of such example would only be of significance if the perpetrators would have had any intention to ignite other massacres, like the one in Srebrenica. There is no mentioning of such an intent in any judgment of the tribunal. Such intent could also not explain why the massacres have been hidden by the Serb forces. Therefore, the Commission cannot share the views of the tribunal that, despite its small size, the population of Srebrenica has formed a substantial part of the overall Muslim population of Bosnia and Herzegovina, because A, it was of significant strategic importance to the Serb leadership, or B, because Srebrenica also became a refuge for Muslims from the region, especially when it was designated a UN safe area. The massacre is being committed to demonstrate the ultimate fate of a much bigger group, then it needs to be addressed as such. The description of a symbolic genocide or regional genocide could be used in such case, given that such regional event has been committed with the specific intent to destroy a regional community as such. It could not in any way be described as a genocide in the way the Genocide Convention is meant to be understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Спасибо большое за такое подробное.
Thank you very much for this detailed, actually, thank you to both our members of the Commission for their very detailed analysis which has been conducted. For us, there are almost no questions left. Everything becomes clear. And the most important is how the suffering in this column that went from Srebrenica to Tuzla, and there has been a detailed research saying that those were, there were both military clashes and suicides and killings. For us, it's very important. In 15 minutes, we have to wrap up our conference, but we have several questions, and I would really love you to answer those questions. Mrs. Yelena Ponomaryova, she's not here with us at this conference anymore, but here is her question, because Western countries, including Germany, insist that it was within this column going to Tuzla, it was a killing of military, captured military men, and it would be needs to be called genocide. Does it mean that the killing of more than 3 million military men, Soviet soldiers during World War II would also need to be labeled as genocide?
Yes,
dear colleagues, the question is for both of you. Maybe we would start with Mr. Greif and then continue with the comments of Mr. Goldbach. Thank you.
I prefer Mr. Goldbach to start, please.
Thank you. Yes, I very much believe that the killing of millions of prisoners of war, of Russian prisoners of war, in connection with the total annihilation of the Russian population, which was planned for the next years to come during the war on Russia, would definitely qualify as a genocide in whatever definition you take and whatever elements of crime you would use, ICC or ICTY.
Yes, I fully agree with this opinion of Mr. Goldbach.
Спасибо. Были еще вопросы, да?
Thank you. There are more questions, if I'm not mistaken.
Just allow me to make one correction to my own speech. When I talked about the breakthrough, per mistake, I mentioned the number of 400 to 500 killed people, but of course I meant 4,000 to 5,000. So I'm correcting now my mistake. Sorry.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Zoom chat. The question is for Mr. Goldbach from Stevan Gajic. What could be the possible legal consequences regarding the work of Srebrenica Commission conducted in the future? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I do not, I mean, from a legal perspective, the trials at the ICTY have now ended. And there is, I think, a question for not on a legal basis, but on a basis of how to bring the groups, the Serbs and the Bosniaks, closer together again. And I think that the stigma that comes with a genocide that's put upon the Serbs really makes it impossible for them to come forward to the Muslims and to be on the same level. So I think that definition of the qualification of this massacre as a non-genocidal action committed with no intentions whatsoever for the rest of Bosnia, it's really important to take away the stigma they would face otherwise.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Еще вопросы, Таня, пожалуйста.
More questions, please. Regnum Agency. I have a small question. How do our reverend experts from the International Commission see the fact that almost immediately after the results were published, the results of their 2-year survey, basically there was adopted INSCO's law was adopted. Is it a coincidence, or maybe in this way the possibility was cut to discuss these results in the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina?
I would like to say only one sentence. I think one should be very naive to believe that this law was just perchance adopted now. I think it was not perchance, and it has very deep intentions, but it doesn't frighten us. We are standing firm behind our report. We believe in every letter of it, not only every sentence, every letter, and no law will lead us away from our conclusions, because we took it very seriously, very scientifically, very authentically. We stand behind it very firmly.
Thank you. Я думаю, что нам...
I think that we have no time left, unfortunately, for questions and even for discussion, because our time, unfortunately, is limited. However, I would like to conclude by saying a few words. I am deeply thankful to everyone who has worked on these reports. Thank you very much for your presentations today at our conference and for having presented the major thesis of your reports. Our task is now for the future to spread the knowledge about events and to propagate the materials that we have discussed and mentioned today. That is very crucial. It's not only crucial for history, but also for the development of our states, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, Republika Srpska, and Serbia in the future. I'm thankful to Gorchakov Foundation for organizing this conference, and I have been asked to say a warm thank you to the Republican Center of War Inquiry, War Crimes, and the missing cases in Banja Luka, who have also for several years searched for documents regarding the events that we're discussing today. I think that after today, we would all love to meet again, and that we would love to discuss these questions, these problems, from the point of view of the development of science and scholar events regarding all the events in former Yugoslavia from 1991 to 1995, because such topics that require close attention and close survey, there are many in Croatia, in Serbia, in Kosovo, in Macedonia. All of these hotspots at the time from the 90s today we could speak about them from a completely different viewpoint. So in case there are no other questions and comments, I would like to close today's conference with a sense of deep gratitude to all of those who have spent several years working on this subject. I can only imagine how difficult it has been for them, because to study and to read so much material and to create a document, I think it's a work that's not been performed by anyone else. So I think that justice will win in the nearest time, and these reports will become arguments in the hands of scholars. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Благодарим всех, дорогие господа.
Thank you all, dear friends.
Dear friends, colleagues, thank you very much once again for your speeches and for your presence. Thank you very much for finding the time to join us today and to present the reports that you have thoroughly devoted yourself for the last year and a half too. And thank you very much for being with us today. Hope to stay in touch, and I wish you a pleasant day. Goodbye.